We can't let last night's debate pass without focusing a little bit more on what would have been insane times headline news for weeks. And that was that most of the candidates, the GOP candidates at last night's debate, agree that we should target and kill the families of terrorists. And those who won't go that far at least say the concern about killing civilians, that's from a different time. We need to not worry about that. We need to be tough. We need to be hard with them. You're going to see that. We've got videos from a couple of the different candidates. We're going to start with Donald Trump.
I'm Josh Jacob from Georgia Tech. Recently, Donald Trump mentioned that we must kill the families of ISIS members. However, this violates the principle of distinction between civilians and combatants in international law. So my question is, how would intentionally killing innocent civilians set us apart from ISIS?
Mr. Trump, we have to be much tougher. We have to be much stronger than we've been. We have people that know what's going on. You take a look at just the attack in California the other day. There were numerous people, including the mother, that knew what was going on. They saw pipe bombs sitting all over the floor. They saw ammunition all over the place. They knew exactly what was going on. I would be very, very firm with families. And frankly, that will make people think, because they may not care much about their lives, but they do care, believe it or not, about their families' lives.
That got applause. That's unbelievable.
Applause.
So let's break that down. First, I will be very firm with their families, meaning
Firm.
you'll kill them. That's
Not man enough to say it.
Yeah, that's what you said earlier. That's what the student asked you about. You said you would kill their families. So that's a new term. I'm going to be very firm, kill you. So then the next question that obviously arises, he says the mom knew. By the way, he doesn't know that at all.
No.
Okay, investigators are looking into exactly who knew and didn't know about the San Bernardino shooting. There was a neighbor apparently that bought some of the weapons for them, so that they should investigate that. But the investigators have said nothing about the mom knowing anything.
Yeah.
Trump made that up. But according to his plan, then he should execute her. Are you going to kill that mom in San Bernardino? Answer the question, right?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm going to be very, very tough. What does that mean, very tough? So and that line there, they may not care much about their lives, but they do care, believe it or not, about their families' lives. Yeah, that's what mobsters say.
Yeah.
You know, but like the worst kind of mobsters, the worst kind of drug gangs. Be like, hey, you know what? We're not going to just kill you. We're going to kill your family members.
Yeah.
That's what Pablo Escobar says. That's what Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi says.
Yeah.
So now you sink to his level and you get wild applause from the Republican base.
Yeah.
According to online polling focus groups, Donald Trump won that debate by saying horrendous, horrific things like that.
Yeah, and look, Hugh Hewitt at least asked some follow-up questions, trying to have them be clear. I mean, you're going to see that when we go to Carson. But like, he wasn't even willing to say there, we'll kill them. No, we'll be tough. We'll be strong. Stop being a wuss. Say what you're going to do. They love to say, we can't possibly defeat ISIS because Obama won't say radical, deadly Islamic radioactive terrorism. He won't say the term, so we can't win. You're saying you're going to be strong, but you can't even say you're going to bomb and kill these families. So why don't you listen to your own points there? Look, they had the follow-up question of where he said, so they get to kill us and we can't kill them? Missing the point that it's the terrorists that kill us, not the terrorist families. And he's there saying he's frustrated that we don't get to act exactly like terrorists.
Now,
why should we be chastised in any way for wanting to kill innocents? And that was a demonstration when you heard the clapping there. We talked, I believe, on the show yesterday, that for all that people love to say that there's something about Islam that makes you fine with jihad and fine with killing innocents. We had the polls, international polls, showing that about 50% of Americans think that the killing of civilians is justified, and the average in the Middle East and North Africa is 14%. And you saw in that audience, it might have been more than 50%. Apparently, something about being a right-wing Christian means that you think it's okay to kill civilians.
So I need to clarify two things here before we get to the other candidates. Number one, in that poll that John's talking about, it's a Gallup poll, it was not collateral damage. They didn't ask about that. They said the intentional killing and targeting of civilians. And in this case, that's exactly what Donald Trump's talking about. He's not saying, oh, well, if we happen to kill their families accidentally, well, that'd be a shame, but we were trying to get the terrorists.
Yeah.
He's saying, no, we should target their families because they might care about their families even if they don't care about their own lives. He says to target them. Now, which 50% of the country you think might be in favor of that? Could it be that it might be more heavily weighted towards Republicans who are like, yes, target and kill civilians, the goddamn terrorists. Speaking of which, that's the second point. They keep saying, let's kill the terrorist families. But when we drop a bomb from the sky in the middle of Syria, are we positive that the person down there is a terrorist and that the family that we're killing is a terrorist family? Or are we just sure that there are terrorists somewhere in Syria and we got some sort of signal intelligence telling us there's a cell phone or a weapon somewhere down there? When they say kill the terrorist families, they just mean let's kill the families down there somewhere.
Yeah.
Okay? So if you know exactly where the terrorists are, we could kill just the terrorists and be done with it.
Yeah.
You don't know where they are. You mean kill random families in the area.
Yeah. I love that the party of family values has become the party of let's use the fact that they value their family to kill their family.
As we continue through this, just think about, first off, yes, with terrorist families, there's that thing, but think about how many people we kill here in our own country, wrongfully, death row, all that stuff. So imagine another country randomly going after people's families, suspected terrorist families. So we already know that's not happening the way they say. But number two, remember the gang murder in Chicago of that kid because he was a suspected gang member's kid? Oh, they outraged because it was Chicago. These ruthless, savage black people. Look at these gang members, these gangsters killing an innocent child. Well, that's what you're doing. You're just like these.
And you're bragging about it.
You're just like these guys, and you're talking about how badass you are. Do you think these gang members are badasses for killing this 9-year-old kid?
But that's
the same guy.
That's what killing their families means.
Yeah.
So now Ben Carson's going to try to put a spin on it like he's helping them. This reminds me of the line from Vietnam. We had to raise the village in order to save the village. No, that means you destroyed the village and didn't save anybody in it. Yeah. So here's a ridiculous analogy.
Could you order airstrikes that would kill innocent children by not the scores, but the hundreds and the thousands? Could you wage war as a commander-in-chief?
Well, interestingly enough, you should see the eyes of some of those children when I say to them, we're going to have to open your head up and take out this tumor. They're not happy about it, believe me. And they don't like me very much at that point. But later on, they love me. You know, they really realize what's going on. And by the same token, you have to be able to look at the big picture and understand that it's actually merciful if you go ahead and finish the job rather than death by 1,000 pricks.
So you are okay with the deaths of thousands of innocent children and civilians? It's like...
You got it. You got it.
That is what war... Can you be as ruthless as Churchill was in prosecuting the war against the Nazis?
Ruthless is not necessarily the word I would use, but tough.
I love that. Ruthless is not the word I would use because it would make me look really bad right now.
So instead, I'll use the nonsense word we use when we say, yes, I would kill your children.
Yeah.
I'm going to be tough.
So we've got Cruz, which I'm going to turn to in 1 second. But before we turn from Carson, I want to remind you, this is the really Christian candidate. This is the guy who lives his life based on his love of Jesus and his reading of the Bible. So which book was it where Jesus was like, fuck them, blow them all to hell?
Yeah.
Has he ever seen the New Testament? The idea that thou shalt not kill, unless you kind of need to, and it's a lot of people, and they're a different race than you. Then you can kill them.
Now, to be fair to Dr. Carson, John, I do remember in the Bible it says, if you get hit on one cheek, turn the other cheek and start carpet bombing.
Yes.
Okay, just to be fair.
If you get slapped on one cheek,
Ezekiel, right?
Yeah, go slap every family member he has, particularly the grandmommies. Anyway, they also had some support from Cruz, who again agrees. He's going to go beyond it because Trump was talking about specifically targeting the families, which is horrendous. Carson and Cruz seem to agree that we need to wipe out the cities, even though they're not man enough to actually say it, really. But here you're going to see Cruz.
You have said you would, quote, carpet bomb ISIS into oblivion, testing whether, quote, sand can glow in the dark. Does that mean leveling the ISIS capital of Raqqa in Syria, where there are hundreds of thousands of civilians?
What it means is using overwhelming air power to utterly and completely destroy ISIS. To put things in perspective, in the first Persian Gulf War, we launched roughly 1,100 air attacks a day. We carpet bombed them for 37 days, saturation bombing, after which our troops went in and in a day and a half mopped up what was left of the Iraqi army. Right now, Obama is launching between 15 and 30 air attacks a day. It is photo op foreign policy.
To be clear, Senator Cruz, Would you carpet bomb Raqqa, the ISIS capital, where there are a lot of civilians? Yes or no?
You would carpet bomb where ISIS is, not a city, but the location of the troops. You use air power directed, and you have embedded special forces to direct the air power. But the object isn't to level a city. The object is to kill the ISIS terrorists.
Okay, so,
That's so stupid.
Fred Kaplan at Slate did a wonderful job of breaking this down. He said, what do you think they're doing? They got a campfire out there in the middle of the desert somewhere like, hey, this is where our troops are. You come on and bomb us. If we knew the coordinates of where their troops are, we would have already bombed them. In fact, we dropped 9,000 bombs on them. It's not like we're not trying.
Yeah.
So, no. When you say carpet bombing, that doesn't mean bomb their military. That's specific bombing. When you say carpet bombing, it means indiscriminate bombing.
Yes.
And ISIS, as Kaplan points out, and he's been a foreign policy expert for a long, long time in the media. We used to have him on the Young Turks all the time as an expert. And he says ISIS does live in the cities. They operate in the cities. Now, you could blame them for that, but if you're going to hit them, you're going to, and especially if you're going to do carpet bombing, yes, you would be killing a ton of civilians. And what does that mean? Nonsense words like, I will utterly destroy them. That's what carpet bombing means. No, that doesn't mean that at all.
That's not what it means.
Okay, and he used the example of Baghdad and the bombs that we dropped on Baghdad. I read a different account from one of the generals who was there, and he said, they don't know what the word carpet bombing means.
They don't.
That is not what we did in Baghdad. We hit very specific military targets. The reason we were able to take it down in a day and a half or so afterwards was because we had already knocked out all their defenses.
Yes.
And we had targeted their military installations and the resources that backed up the military. We didn't drop random bombs on civilians that wouldn't have helped our cause in taking Baghdad. So Ted Cruz doesn't know a thing about the military. He's just a blowhard who just comes in and says, I'm going to be tough. I'm going to utterly destroy them. I'm going to carpet bomb them. He's a child. And of course, since he's trying to appeal to other children, they're like, yay, I want school lunches for free and trips to Hawaii at every break. Right? That's not how it works, you child.
The funny thing is that he, when he came into the Senate, was supposed to be one of the new intellectuals. He was one of the smart
Intellectual.
ones. So Iraq, one of the most famous things about the Iraq conflict was it was the first large-scale American military conflict with the introduction of guided munitions. That we were able to, look, they sucked. They were terrible, and they had lots of mistakes, but the whole point was that we were trying not to destroy as many civilian buildings as possible, but he doesn't know that. He says you don't kill them in the cities, you kill them where they are. So does he not know that they're in the cities? Or is he just not willing to say that he'll carpet bomb cities? He should know, by the way, that they're in Raqqa, since it was posed to him as a question twice in about 2 minutes. He doesn't seem to know it. And again, I'll carpet bomb them. Okay, so you're going to bomb the city? No, I mean guided. So does he not know what carpet bomb... Like, I honestly, at this point, don't know if he's just being stupid or if he's being evasive. Or if he's being stupid and evasive.
Nah, he's a smarmy politician. He knows. He knows that carpet bombing tests well with the barbarians that are Republican voters in primaries.
Yeah.
And so he says that, and he says, I'll make the sand glow at night. We turn it into glass.
Which is a joke about nuking the Middle East, by the way.
Yeah, and they're killing hundreds of thousands of civilians. And he smirks while Wolf was reading that quote. And there's laughter in the crowd like, yeah, let's kill him. So, Cruz, would he do it? Yeah, he probably would. Is he that barbaric? Absolutely, right?
Yeah.
Why is he doing it? Does he not know that ISIS is inside civilian centers? No, he knows that. He's not that dumb.
Yeah.
Okay, he just says it because he knows the people I'm trying to appeal to are some of the worst people on earth. And I think if I say this, I'll get to win their votes. And then if I have to, I'll do it. Who cares? I'm a slimy politician.
Yeah, and again, as I did with Ben Carson, I have to remind you, Ted Cruz, one of the most religious people on the stage, driven by his faith, raised by his father, Rafael Cruz, to believe that he's the chosen one, some sort of acolyte of God. And yet, for some reason, his constant reading of the Bible hasn't stopped him from wanting to kill thousands or hundreds of thousands of civilians. Perhaps it contributed in some way.
Well, it's not that surprising because, like the fundamentalist Muslims, these fundamentalist Christians believe in killing civilians. They don't have any problem with it at all. They just said it.
They just said
We'll kill their families and we'll carpet bomb their cities. This is the kind of insane crap that Ann Coulter used to say to be so over the top to garner attention, right? Now it's become mainstream and gets wild applause in a Republican debate. So understand who you are. You're in league with the terrorists. That's what terrorists do. Terrorists say we will kill their families and we will bomb them indiscriminately. Republicans agree.